I helped my brother's fiancée break free from his total control over her and the children, for he left everyone traumatized, but not just mentally. I'm a 34-year-old single mom with two amazing kids, Liam, 8, and Ava, 5. Life hasn't been a cakewalk, but we've built a happy, stable home. It's just us against the world, and I wouldn't have it any other way. My older brother, Matthew, is the golden boy of the family. He has it all, a high-paying job, a big house, and his stay-at-home wife, Emily. But here's the kicker, Matthew is controlling. He's the kind of guy who thinks his way is the only way, and anyone else is just failing at life. The tension between us has always been there, but it hit a boiling point during a family barbecue. Matthew, in true fashion, decided it was the perfect time to criticize every single aspect of my life. From my parenting style to my choice of career, he aired it all out in front of everyone. "You need to get your priorities straight," he said, loud enough for the whole family to hear. My face burned with embarrassment, but I didn't respond. I just wanted to leave and forget it ever happened. Then, a few days later, I got a knock on the door. It was CPS. Someone had made an anonymous report about my kids' welfare. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly who was behind it. Even though CPS cleared us after their visit, the damage was done. I felt violated and paranoid. Who would do that to a family member? At the same time, I started noticing something off about Matthew's own family. His kids, Ethan, 10, and Sophie, 7, were quiet and withdrawn, and Emily seemed to walk on eggshells around him. Something wasn't right, but I wasn't sure if it was my place to get involved. That was until Emily gave me a look, a pleading look, when she thought no one was watching. It was a fleeting moment, but it hit me hard. For the first time, I wondered if maybe Matthew wasn't the perfect husband and father everyone thought he was. And just like that, the wheels started turning. The CPS visit and Matthew's public humiliation at the barbecue had left me on edge, but my suspicions about his seemingly perfect life grew stronger with every passing day. At the next family gathering, I decided to observe instead of engage. What I noticed was subtle but impossible to ignore. Ethan and Sophie barely interacted with anyone, their eyes constantly darting to their father, as if gauging his every move. Meanwhile, Emily lingered in the kitchen, keeping herself busy with tasks that didn't need doing, her shoulders tense and her face carefully neutral. Not long after, I received an unexpected message from someone I barely remembered, an old acquaintance of Emily's. She brought up Matthew's latest social media post about our family barbecue but quickly shifted the conversation, hinting at Emily's private struggles. According to her, Emily had been venting anonymously in an online forum, describing the pressures of her marriage and the suffocating control her husband exerted over her. Though names weren't mentioned, the descriptions were unmistakable. The words stuck with me for days, filling me with equal parts dread and resolve. I debated whether to say something to Emily, but fear of overstepping held me back. If she was already walking on eggshells, what would happen if Matthew found out she'd confided in someone, even indirectly? Fate stepped in before I could make up my mind. A week later, Emily called me out of the blue. The conversation began with polite small talk, but her voice carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. As the call went on, her facade cracked, and she began to share details about her life that left me stunned. Matthew's temper wasn't just an occasional flare-up, it had become a daily storm. He monitored her phone, criticized every decision she made, and controlled even the smallest details of her life. She felt trapped, she admitted, and had for a long time. Emily's words haunted me long after the call ended. This wasn't just marital stress, this was a woman in a deeply toxic situation, with 2 children caught in the crossfire. I knew I had to help, but I also knew the risks. That night, I began piecing together a plan. I documented everything I'd observed, Matthew's controlling behavior, Emily's quiet cries for help, and the nervousness etched into Ethan and Sophie's faces. Though it felt small and disjointed, it was a start. The following morning, I reached out to Emily again. I shared what I'd noticed and offered my support. Her response was cautious but grateful, and for the first time, it felt like she wasn't entirely alone. We both knew the stakes. If Matthew caught wind of our plans, the fallout could be catastrophic. Yet, as daunting as it seemed, the alternative, doing nothing, was far worse. After that conversation, a quiet but determined partnership began forming between Emily and me. We didn't dive into plans right away, instead, we worked to build trust and gather strength. Emily started opening up more, sharing glimpses of what life was like behind the walls of Matthew's seemingly perfect home. The stories painted a grim picture, his temper flaring over trivial things, the children being scolded for minor mistakes, and Emily's every move scrutinized as if she were a misbehaving child. Behind the scenes, I started doing research. I learned about local resources for victims of domestic abuse, consulted online forums for advice, and connected with a family lawyer who was known for handling complex custody cases. It was overwhelming at first, but each small step felt like progress. Emily, too, began to take small steps. She started saving money, little by rounding down her grocery expenses and pocketing the difference. I helped her set up a bank account in her name, one Matthew wouldn't know existed. Each dollar she saved became a symbol of hope, a tangible step toward independence. Despite these small victories, the risks loomed large. Matthew was perceptive and controlling. He had a way of sensing when things were out of place. Once, Emily slipped and mentioned a conversation we'd had about school programs for Ethan and Sophie. Matthew's response was swift and brutal, though not physical. He unleashed a tirade about her overstepping her role and undermining his authority. When Emily relayed the story to me, she sounded shaken but resolute. "I'll be more careful," she said. The breaking point came during another family gathering. This time, I noticed Ethan had bruises on his arms, faint but unmistakable. When I asked him gently about it, he mumbled something about falling off his bike. His nervous glance toward Matthew told me otherwise. That night, I told Emily what I'd seen. Her voice cracked as she admitted that Matthew had grabbed Ethan too hard during an argument about homework. The urgency of the situation hit us both like a freight train. This wasn't just about Emily's freedom anymore, it was about protecting Ethan and Sophie from a cycle of fear and control. We decided it was time to accelerate the plan. Emily reached out to the lawyer I'd found, and together, they began building a case. She started keeping a detailed journal of incidents, Matthew's outbursts, the way he treated the kids, and the moments when his temper crossed the line. It was a race against time. Matthew's control over his family was tightening, and we both knew that if he sensed what we were doing, it could all come crashing down. But for the first time, there was also hope. Emily wasn't facing this alone anymore, and with every quiet step we took, we moved closer to freedom. As the days turned into weeks, our quiet efforts started to solidify into a real plan. Emily and I worked in careful secrecy, meeting at safe places like parks or libraries under the pretense of errands. Every decision, every move, had to be meticulously thought out to avoid arousing Matthew's suspicion. Emily's journal grew thicker with each entry. She documented everything, every harsh word, every unreasonable demand, every instance where Matthew's temper spilled over. It was heartbreaking to read, but also critical. The lawyer emphasized the importance of evidence, and Emily was building a damning case. In the meantime, I focused on logistics. I connected with a local shelter that specialized in helping women and children escape abusive situations. They offered Emily a place to stay when the time came, along with counseling and support for her and the kids. I also found a trusted financial advisor who helped us discreetly transfer Emily's savings into her secret account, ensuring she'd have some financial stability when she left. The toughest part was keeping Ethan and Sophie in the dark, for their own safety. They were too young to fully understand what was happening, and any slip could lead to Matthew discovering the plan. Still, I started finding ways to connect with them. I'd invite them over to my house for movie nights with Liam and Ava, where they could laugh and play without fear of their father's anger. Slowly, they began to open up, revealing just how much tension they carried in their little shoulders. But Matthew wasn't entirely oblivious. His controlling nature made him hyper-aware of changes in routine, and Emily's increasing confidence hadn't gone unnoticed. One evening, after she'd been out longer than usual, Matthew demanded to know where she'd been. When her answer didn't satisfy him, he accused her of lying, of disrespecting him. It didn't escalate further, but it was clear the walls were closing in. Emily called me in tears that night, her resolve faltering. "What if I can't do this? What if he finds out before I can leave?" she asked. Her fears were valid, but I reminded her of the progress we'd made. She wasn't the same isolated, powerless woman she'd been months ago. She had resources, allies, and a plan. Most importantly, she had a future waiting for her, a future where she and the kids could finally breathe freely. The turning point came when the lawyer finalized the custody strategy. Armed with Emily's journal, testimonies from a few trusted friends, and records of Matthew's behavior, the case was solid. All we needed now was the right moment to execute the plan. That moment arrived sooner than expected. One evening, Matthew's temper flared again, this time over something trivial, a forgotten grocery item. His yelling shook the house, and Ethan and Sophie huddled together in the corner, too scared to move. Emily described the scene to me later, her voice heavy with determination. "That's it," she said. "We're leaving. Tomorrow." The plan was set into motion. While Matthew was at work the next day, Emily packed essentials for herself and the kids, clothes, important documents, cherished toys. I arrived with my car, and we loaded everything as quickly and quietly as we could. By the time Matthew came home, the house was empty. Emily and the kids were safe at the shelter by then, but the battle was far from over. Matthew would fight back, of that we were certain. But for the first time in years, Emily and the kids had taken a step toward freedom, and there was no turning back. When Matthew returned home to find the house empty, his reaction was as swift as it was predictable. At first, he tried a facade of calm, sending messages that feigned concern. The words dripped with manipulation, subtle pleas that asked where Emily and the kids were, acting as if he was simply worried for their well-being. But as silence greeted each of his attempts, his tone shifted sharply. The texts became hostile, each one more venomous than the last. He accused Emily of betrayal and painted her as unstable, threatening to ruin her life and take the children back at any cost. Emily sat quietly in the shelter as the messages came in, her face pale but composed. She had known this would happen, prepared for it even, yet seeing it unfold was still overwhelming. Matthew's next move was to turn to social media. He spun a narrative where he was the victim of an unhinged wife who had recklessly uprooted their family. Friends and distant relatives, unaware of the real story, began reaching out. Emily stayed silent, her resolve unshaken. The lawyer advised her to let the facts speak for themselves when the time came. Meanwhile, Matthew's desperation became more evident. One morning, while driving Liam to school, I spotted Matthew's car parked near the shelter. He wasn't inside it, but the implication was clear: he was trying to track Emily down. A rush of panic ran through me as I realized how close he had come to finding her and the kids. I called the shelter immediately, and they enacted their security measures, ensuring Emily and the children stayed protected. When I told Emily what had happened later that day, her expression hardened, her determination only growing. The lawyer acted quickly, filing for a temporary restraining order and emergency custody of Ethan and Sophie. The evidence Emily had been documenting, her journal, photographs of bruises, and even audio clips of Matthew's verbal abuse, proved crucial. It was enough to convince the court to limit Matthew's access to supervised visitation, a decision that struck a significant blow to his self-crafted image. As expected, Matthew retaliated. He began spreading malicious rumors, accusing both Emily and me of conspiring to turn the children against him. The accusations were absurd, but his desperation made him reckless. His behavior grew more erratic, and those around him started noticing cracks in his polished facade. At a family gathering, Matthew's frustration boiled over in an explosive outburst. When someone gently questioned his version of events, he reacted with unrestrained fury, shouting and pacing as the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even his closest supporters couldn't ignore the troubling display, and it left many questioning what they had previously believed. Emily, meanwhile, focused on moving forward. The shelter offered counseling for her and the children, helping them begin the long process of healing. Ethan and Sophie, who had spent years walking on eggshells around their father, started to open up about their fears and experiences. Emily, too, began confronting the emotional toll of her years with Matthew, finding strength she hadn't realized she had. The tides were turning. Matthew's control, once ironclad, was slipping away. His anger and desperation were no longer tools of intimidation, they were unraveling his carefully curated world. For Emily and the children, the path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was their own. With the restraining order in place and supervised visits underway, Emily and her children began piecing their lives back together. The shelter provided not only safety but also counseling, helping them heal from years of fear and manipulation. Slowly, laughter began to return to Ethan and Sophie, and Emily herself rediscovered pieces of who she once was. One day, Emily picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years. What started as a quiet escape from stress soon became an outlet for the emotions she had suppressed. Her art, much like her life, began to bloom again. Meanwhile, Matthew's tightly controlled narrative was unraveling. During supervised visits, his attempts to assert dominance were noted by the caseworker. This, along with Emily's detailed journal and evidence of past incidents, built a strong case against him. His increasingly erratic public outbursts alienated the family members who had once defended him. As Emily grew stronger, so did her resolve. With help, she secured a small apartment where she and the kids could start fresh. Moving day was an emotional milestone. Ethan and Sophie's laughter filled the air as they explored their new home, drawing pictures of their safe place on a chalkboard. It wasn't just a new address, it was the start of a new chapter. Though the custody battle wasn't over and Matthew remained a looming threat, Emily faced these challenges with a determination born from survival. For the first time in years, she saw hope, not just for herself, but for her children. The weight of the past no longer defined them. Together, they were building something new. The custody hearings began shortly after Emily and the kids settled into their new home. It was the first time she had to face Matthew in a courtroom, and his presence was as unnerving as ever. Dressed impeccably, he played the role of a concerned father, but his smug glances at Emily betrayed his true nature. Matthew's legal team argued that Emily had overreacted by leaving, painting her as unstable and manipulative. They even claimed she had alienated Ethan and Sophie from their father. But Emily's lawyer was prepared. The evidence, her journal, the caseworker's observations, and testimony from counselors, was damning. The courtroom became a battleground of narratives. Matthew's calm facade began to crack under cross-examination, especially when the judge questioned his history of controlling behavior. His short temper betrayed him, and the judge took notice. Ethan and Sophie's well-being remained at the center of the case. The children's counselor submitted a report that highlighted their anxiety around their father and their improved behavior since moving in with Emily. It was clear the kids felt safer in their new environment. Despite Matthew's attempts to discredit her, Emily stayed composed. She answered every question truthfully, her quiet strength shining through. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of life under Matthew's control and her determination to protect her children. After weeks of hearings, the judge ruled in Emily's favor, granting her full custody. Matthew's visitation was limited to supervised meetings in a neutral setting. The decision was a relief, but it also marked the end of a long and exhausting chapter. As Emily walked out of the courthouse, she felt the weight of years of fear and uncertainty begin to lift. Ethan and Sophie greeted her with hugs and smiles, unaware of the magnitude of what had just happened. For the first time, Emily truly believed they were free. With the custody battle behind her, Emily could finally focus on the life ahead. The small apartment, once a temporary refuge, began to feel like home. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. Ethan and Sophie adjusted quickly to their new routine. Their laughter filled the rooms as they decorated their space with hand-drawn art and hung their favorite posters. They began thriving at school, their teachers noting how much more confident and engaged they seemed compared to before. Emily also made strides. The shelter had connected her with job training programs, and she began working part-time at a local art studio. What started as a way to pay the bills became a source of pride and healing. She poured her creativity into teaching art classes for children, finding fulfillment in helping them express themselves. While life moved forward, there were still challenges. Matthew remained bitter, his supervised visits tense and awkward. He often used the time to make passive-aggressive remarks or demand updates about Emily's life. The kids, however, grew less anxious over time, learning to see these visits for what they were, moments they had to endure, not define their lives. Support from family and friends helped Emily regain her footing. Some relatives who had initially sided with Matthew reached out, apologizing for believing his narrative. Others kept their distance, unwilling to admit they'd been wrong. Emily didn't dwell on it. Her focus was on building a future for herself and her children. One evening, as the kids played a board game on the living room floor, Emily paused to watch them. For the first time in years, they looked carefree, their laughter bubbling over as they teased each other about winning. It hit her how far they'd come. The shadows of Matthew's control still lingered, but they no longer ruled their lives. Each day brought new milestones, small victories that added up to something bigger: freedom, safety, and the chance to dream again. Despite the court ruling in the new life they were building, Matthew's presence still lingered like a storm cloud. Though his visitation rights were limited, he continued to make Emily's life difficult, using any chance he could to try and regain control. The most jarring moment came one evening when Matthew showed up unannounced at Emily's apartment. He stood at the door, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. Emily, heart pounding, felt a surge of panic before she reminded herself of the boundaries the court had set. "I need to speak to my kids," he demanded, his voice low but sharp. Emily stood firm. "No, Matthew. You know the rules. This is a supervised visit." Matthew glared at her, but he knew better than to argue in front of her. His frustration boiled over, and for a brief moment, Emily saw the same man who had controlled and manipulated her for years. But she didn't flinch. She had been through too much to let him regain that power. He left, fuming, but his words stayed with Emily. She could feel the weight of his bitterness even after he was gone. Yet, despite his continued attempts to undermine her, Emily stood her ground. She knew she couldn't let his anger creep back into her life. In the weeks that followed, Matthew's behavior became more erratic. He reached out to mutual friends and even some family members, trying to turn them against Emily again. His efforts were in vain, however. More and more people started seeing through his facade. Emily had found her voice, and with it, the truth had spread far and wide. Eventually, Matthew was forced to accept the new reality. The supervised visits continued, but they became less frequent as the courts noticed the ongoing issues with his temper. Emily, once trapped in a cycle of fear, now had the freedom to move forward with her life. One day, as she sat with Liam, Ava, Ethan, and Sophie at the park, watching them run around and laugh without a care in the world, she realized how far they had come. They were free, truly free, and nothing Matthew could say or do would ever change that. Months passed, and the shadows of the past began to fade. Emily, Ethan, and Sophie embraced their new life with a sense of peace they had never known before. Their small apartment, once a refuge, had become a home filled with love, laughter, and new traditions. Ethan started playing soccer at a local league, finding a confidence that had once been stifled. Sophie joined a reading club at school and began bringing home stories that filled the evenings with joy. Their healing wasn't linear, but their progress was undeniable. They were thriving in ways Emily had only dreamed of during those dark years. For Emily, the journey was about more than survival. It was about rediscovery, of her passions, her resilience, and her identity outside of Matthew's control. She worked her way up at the art studio, eventually organizing a community exhibit showcasing works by survivors of abuse. Her own paintings, filled with vibrant colors and bold strokes, told a story of strength and renewal. Support from family and friends grew stronger as the truth about Matthew's behavior continued to spread. Even those who had doubted Emily at first began to reach out, offering apologies and a willingness to mend fractured relationships. Emily accepted these gestures with grace but was careful to prioritize the well-being of her children and herself. Matthew's presence in their lives diminished. The courts further restricted his visitation after repeated complaints from caseworkers, and eventually, he stopped fighting for control. His world, once so meticulously crafted, had crumbled under the weight of his actions. One evening, as Emily tucked Ethan and Sophie into bed, Sophie asked a question that caught her off guard. "Mom, are we safe now?" Emily's throat tightened, but she smiled and brushed a strand of hair from Sophie's face. "Yes, sweetheart. We're safe now." That night, Emily sat alone in the living room, a cup of tea in her hands and a sense of peace settling over her. The battle had been long and grueling, but it was over. The future was theirs to shape, free from fear and control. For the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to dream, not just for her children, but for herself. Their new chapter had truly begun.